Good day, everyone, and welcome to today's Devops.com webinar. We're excited that you've joined us. The topic of today's webinar is MedImpact's Journey to Database Automation. The webinar is sponsored by Datacall. My name is Mitch Ashley, and I'll serve as your host and moderator for the webinar. A few housekeeping items before we begin. I want to make sure that everybody knows that we'll be sending out the recording information as well as the slides that are used in today's webinar. You'll be able to get that on devops.com as well as an email with links that we'll send to you following the webinar. We also highly encourage you to ask questions, so please pop those into the GoToWebinar questions tab, and we'll be glad to get to as many of those as possible. Last but not least, we are giving away 3 $50 Amazon gift cards at the conclusion of the webinar, so hang in there to find out who our 3 winners are. Now let's move on to our topic, MedImpact's Journey to Database Automation. It's my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Mabuti Nandu. Mabuti is Director of IT, Database and Middleware Administration at MedImpact Healthcare Systems. Mabuti, I'm going to turn it over to you. Take it from here.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody, or morning, wherever you are. As introduced, I will speak through MedImpact Healthcare Systems' journey to database automation, database deployment automation. A quick overview, I'll tell you who we are and what deployment challenges we needed to work through. I'll speak through the automation initiatives that we put together in response to those challenges and talk you real quickly through the implementation process, and then some quick takeaways from all of that. Then you'll have the opportunity to ask questions after the fact. So without further ado, let me get into the material. So many organizations view database deployment differently from they do software deployments. The amount of rigor around database deployment is not exactly the same as with normal software deployment. Examples include most organizations are very disciplined about the process of checking code into Git and checking it out in an automated fashion as they push it through the various environments in their enterprise. Not so much with databases. This is for a number of reasons. Number one, the database code space itself has traditionally been managed by either DBAs or DBA developers. Very few organizations can afford to have developers specifically dedicated to the database environment. Secondly, the number of tools available to manage code in the database space, everything from the actual repositories to the deployment process, and the orchestration between all of that has been limited in the market. It's a fairly new space that a few players even today are playing in. So those limitations have made it difficult for database deployments to be treated with the same rigor that normal software deployments regularly are. MedImpact had exactly the same set of challenges. So we decided to put together an initiative to overcome that. The process of understanding what changes we needed to make and the justification process to eventually make the investments that now helping us address those challenges are what this presentation essentially is going to describe. So, who is MedImpact? We are what is called a pharmacy benefit management company. We were founded in 1989 and are based, headquartered right here in San Diego, California. We have a presence throughout the United States and a few international offices as well, South Africa, the Middle East, and China, to name a few. Pharmacy benefit management companies essentially help reduce the prescription drug costs and improve efficiency of availability of drugs to end consumers. Now, that is a loaded statement. What we essentially do is process pharmacy drug claims, insurance claims. Okay. In the United States, I think everybody would be familiar with this concept for the most part. When you are part of when you have membership to some health insurance group, like Kaiser or Blue Shield, Blue Cross, you go to your doctor using your insurance. Your doctor prescribes drugs to you. Then you go to the pharmacy and get those drugs, and the insurance company pays a portion of that cost, a significant portion. You have a copay, and so on and so forth. That processing of that claim for the drug specifically is not handled by your healthcare provider. It's actually handled by a niche set of companies called pharmacy benefit managers. They process that claim. They find your record, understand what your benefits are, how much your copay is, what drugs you're eligible for, and so on and so forth. And they actually handle the processing of your claim. It's not your healthcare provider who's doing it. It's the PBM who your healthcare provider is partnering with. In addition to the claims adjudication itself, we offer a number of ancillary services, everything from formulary management. Formulary is essentially just the a list of available drugs within your plan that are approved to be prescribed to you. Among the services we provide is making sure that the drugs you're getting are within that formulary. We also do cross-checks to make sure that you're not being prescribed a new drug that could cause complications based on another drug you're already taking at that time. We do some analysis around fraud, waste, and abuse. We look at patterns of usage and make sure that there is no potential for abuse or fraud. We also provide services around rebate management for healthcare providers that provide rebates for certain conditions, clinical program management. So we have a whole variety of ancillary services that we provide in addition to the core processing of the pharmacy claims themselves. MedImpact specifically has a specific focus within this space. Our focus is to provide quality care for the individual members, the patient who's actually getting that medication. We offer a number of services that make sure that they're getting the best care, specifically around the cost of the drugs that they're getting, and that they're getting the best value drugs at the best pricing that could be potentially available within the market. A number of services we offer optimize all of that. That is good for the patient, but it's also good for the healthcare organization that they belong to. So we modify and optimize our service offerings in response to trends such as medication usage, costing trends, formulary trends, industry trends within the pharmaceutical market, and even government regulations. We're constantly looking at all of that and then modifying our service offerings, tweaking them in collaboration with our clients to make sure that they're constantly getting the best value out of all of that. There are very few players in this space. In fact, most people don't even know this whole industry exists. There's less than 20 companies doing this across the United States, and the top 5, of which MedImpact is either 4th or 5th, depending on which metrics you use, own over 80% of the market. The remaining 15 or so have the remaining 18% or so. So our unique business model, based on how I just described how we respond to market and technology and government forces, means that we are constantly changing our value offerings and constantly analyzing a lot of data as a result of all of that. We differentiate ourselves by containing costs and driving value with quality member care, but that comes with an important set of challenges that we have to address. Our value proposition dictates that our data views be agile. We must be able to change them as needed, as the trends change, as the data changes. We need to be able to respond very quickly to that, do some analysis based on it, and then provide feedback to our clients so that we can present that value sooner rather than later. As a result of all of that, there are always concerns about availability when you're changing that frequently, and the quality of your data. So we offer performance guarantees based on exactly that. Even if our back end is changing significantly, we guarantee our clients that their data will always have a certain level of quality, that our systems will always be available to a certain percentage, and so on and so forth. So it's a unique set of challenges that requires us to always be on top of the management of change within our data landscape. Unique set of challenges, one that we have for the most part addressed manually up until now. Over the last year or so, we've been in the process of adopting agile software development methodologies to help address the need to change quickly and responsively with quality. And so we're in the process of implementing agile software development practices, and this has also touched our data landscape as well. All of this requires that we have reliable data change management practices so that we can eliminate or at least minimize errors within our environment. But as you can imagine, with all of that comes a specific set of challenges with deployments. Deployments become very complex, and they involve a lot of people, and they require a lot of validation and testing in order for us to meet our performance guarantees with quality and with stability and availability. So just to describe some of the challenges we used to have, and in a few cases are still working through, because quite frankly our database deployment automation initiative is still very much in progress today. We had a specific set of challenges around practices or processes, around people, and around tools, and I'll describe those in a little bit of detail over the next couple of slides. First set of challenges was specifically with processes or practices. As I mentioned in my opening overview statement, our database deployments were not treated with the same rigor that software deployments were, and all of you in IT will probably be familiar with this. I've worked for many organizations, large and small, startups to Fortune 50 companies, and this challenge was present in all of them for the most part. Database deployments were not treated the same way as software deployments were. Even if we had software source code in Git, including for databases, the amount of traceability from the moment that code is checked out and deployed through the various environments, from dev all the way out to production, was not the same amount of rigor that you would have on the software side. It didn't have the same amount of traceability. There was a lot more manual steps within database deployment than there was in the software side. So as a result of some of this, the database deployment components, whether you're deploying PL SQL packages or some DML that adds feed data or configuration data into the database to support a software development, all of those were not part of the core build package or the build of materials in that specific deployment. In fact, sometimes we would deploy the database changes days or even weeks ahead of the software deployment in order to account for some of the challenges that came with that. Additionally, the deployment processes were mostly manual. We'd check the code out of Git, and then a DBA or DBA developer would push them into dev. And then once the dev team said this was good, they'll push it into QA, and then they'll manually push it into UAT and end-to-end testing environments. And when everybody was aligned, it would be a manual push into production. Yes, 3 sets of eyes on it, so on and so forth. But as you can see, this is a labor-intensive, long deployment process that's not at all agile. And sometimes because it's manual, if one DBA did a deployment in one environment and another DBA did a deployment into another environment, you'd have some inconsistencies based on the number of steps or the order of steps that they executed. That became a challenge as well, and it was difficult to reconcile differences between environments. If something worked in UAT but is not working in validation, why is that? It was difficult to explain. We also had limited ability to audit when changes occurred in an environment. We may log the change that actually happened, but it was not as easy to say exactly when it changed. We had limited visibility into deployments that failed. Sometimes when you have very large scripts and one very small portion of it fails, the manual process of reviewing logs was not always accurate, and you would miss things every once in a while. Bottom line, all of this was extremely labor intensive. Took a lot more time than it necessarily needed to. Within the people space, we had about 3 teams that had the capability to deploy. We had the DBA developers who deployed most of the actual DDL into the vast majority of environments. And then you had software engineering teams who had the ability to deploy PL SQL that was specific to their applications within the same environments except production. And then you had configuration management who would deploy to production. And then you also had business teams who had the ability to deploy configuration, or what we call code changes, into environment. Their deployments were mainly DML, but they too are making deployment changes that could potentially change the behavior of an application, which is what the code or configuration deployments essentially are. Tweaking flags so that an application or configuration causes an application to behave differently. All of this had limited visibility to anyone who's trying to understand why a problem or an issue occurred in a given environment. You've got multiple hands in the pot, so to speak, and to figure out who made a change that caused an issue could at times become very, very difficult. We had rigorous validation and testing processes, but again, it being manual meant that it was very challenging. Combine all of this, the process issues and the people issues, and you find that the outcomes also can be very difficult to manage. So even if we had rigorous manual verifications, we did rigorous unit testing and development, we had rigorous QA testing. After QA, we've got a test and validation environment in which a combination of IT people and business people work together to validate that whatever changes we're making are accurate and don't cause disruption. And that the outcome is exactly what we expect. Then we push it into a user acceptance environment in which we actually solicited clients' participation. Some of our clients would actually come into these environments and also test the changes that we're making. Even if we're that rigorous, at times we still had issues and failures. They were few, but when they did happen, they were very costly. The process for validation itself is extremely costly from a resource headcount perspective, as you can imagine. But the fixing of issues when they do occur in the production environment also was very costly. We had long, arduous debugging processes when deployments failed in all environments, but especially in production. We had unexpected post-deployment incidents in all environments, but again, most painfully in production. They were rare, but when they did happen, they could essentially cause months of retesting, recoding, revalidation, and so on and so forth. Ultimately, the entire software delivery timeline was much longer than it needed to do. And then, of course, the rework is another outcome that was unfortunate. So how do we address all of this? This is what prompted us to put together what we call the Database Deployment Automation Initiative. We essentially challenged ourselves to build a database deployment automated process that would provide a consistent framework of deployments in all environments for all database deployments, whether they be DDL or DML, for all of our custom databases. Just to give you a little bit of understanding of our environment, because of the guarantees we offer, we have multiple copies of the same data. Some of it is physically replicated. Some of it is logically replicated. This is how we guarantee uptime. When we deploy, we do gradual partial deployments through those environments and verify that systems have not broken, and then gradually pass them through to additional environments. So one database, production database, may have 4 copies, 2 of which are physically replicated, 2 of which are logically replicated. That allows us to deploy to one environment without affecting another. And then when we know that one is stable, we deploy to the other one as well. And that's just an example for our production environment. In our non-production environment, the duplication of the same data sets is even broader than that. So we could have 16 copies of a QA database, for instance. So we needed a way to make sure we can deploy to all of these environments in the same way every time and expect the same outcome every time. We needed to identify a tool that would allow us to do all of this, but in addition, enforce the deployment from source code and be able to audit that this actually happened. We wanted to be able to tell that this deployment happened on this particular date. We wanted to be able to tell which components of the deployment failed and why they failed. That would make the analysis for why a little bit easier. And then finally, we wanted to make sure that we can integrate this deployment process on the database side with the rest of the software deployment mechanisms we were building as part of our broader Devops drive and the agile transformation we were making on the software delivery side. And in fact, we started working side by side with the software side of the house to make sure that we're in lock and step. They were already in the process of adopting the Atlassian stack of tools, Jenkins, Jira, JAMA, and so on and so forth. And so we wanted a tool that would integrate seamlessly with the rest of that. Those were essentially our objectives. So we went ahead then and tried to justify these investments. Being the geeks that we were, we thought this would be really easy. It is self-explanatory. The benefits were clear and obvious. We essentially went into executive management and said, if we invest in such a set of tools, we'll immediately improve deployment quality and we'll have a much faster, more agile turnaround. And so we should go ahead and spend X amount of money. It should be pretty straightforward. Should be able to understand it in a single 1-hour conversation. Obviously, executive management doesn't quite work that way. So several questions were immediately asked through a series of meetings that ultimately took about 3 to 4 months to fully address. Questions are asked as to why we just simply couldn't improve the existing processes. Did we need to throw more people at the issue, or did we maybe have too many people, too many hands in the pot? Did we need to reorient our teams? Did we need to put DBA developers in every single software team to address these challenges? Things we noted, obviously, were that you can only manage fatigue to a point. When you have processes that are that manual, it is way too challenging to eliminate the human factor, because it doesn't matter how many people you throw at a problem, ultimately somebody will make a mistake. Because they're tired, or because on that particular day they're not paying attention, or they have too much on their plate, it will happen. Also, adding people to a manual process doesn't necessarily make it go faster. I think we all understand this. We've seen it in many ways, different forms across any kind of IT knowledge space. So we decided to go back and do a little bit more homework and try and make the justification a little bit clearer from an executive perspective. In our second round justification, we described the same value we talked of at first: improved deployment quality and a more agile turnaround. But in addition to this, we spent a significant amount of time, almost 2 months by the time we were done, documenting, first analyzing and documenting the reduction in deployment costs that such a tool set would offer, the reduction in rework and the associated costs and schedule impacts that such a tool would offer. And then, of course, the benefits of being able to seamlessly integrate with the planned CI/CD processes that were being planned across the rest of the software development organization. This took a significant amount of effort, but if I were to encourage anyone who's thinking of going down this journey, I would say this to you: this is where you will need to spend the time to make the justification for the investment. If you do not do this, you probably will spend a lot more time answering questions than you will describing and actually showing the value. So in our second round, then, we spent a significant amount of time describing the opportunity cost. We went to the detail of actually describing the labor cost of our slow deployments within the environment, counted the number of people who are involved in a typical deployment from development all the way through to production, counted the amount of time on average that they do, and we use actual data pulling from our Chronos systems and our time card systems and JIRA for all the tasks that are spent in these states, calculate the actual cost using a knowledge worker-based rate, and actually describe that value in dollar terms at the end of that. We also calculated the cost of the manual verifications that we did both on the IT side, dev, QA, and also on the business side. We did not go into the detail for our client organizations because we did not want to reach out to them and ask what it costs them, but there is that cost that we stated exists even if we did not quantify it. Then we also calculated the cost of deployment rework for a number of rework items that had come through over the last year. All of that took a significant amount of effort, but it was absolutely worth it in the end. We also put together a roadmap on how we would actually implement this tool, select it, and then implement it. We described the tool, what we saw as a tool evaluation process, and how we would ultimately choose one of a number of options, which we understood at that point was about 4. We stated that we would go into a proof of value to make sure that the tool would deliver on the value that we were expecting. We aligned with our executives on what success would look like and documented it accordingly, and built some criteria for proving that as part of the proof of value. And then we committed to doing some reference calls with enterprises who would have implemented such a tool. This time around, they said, good plan, go ahead and move on it, and we'll be willing to make the investment based on your outcome, assuming a positive proof of value process, which got us into the implementation process. So we evaluated a number of tools in this space. We looked at the industry players. The ones we thought were serious in the domain were about 4. It was a bit challenging because, as I mentioned earlier, this is a relatively new domain. I think it's only in the last 10 to 15 years or so that companies have been investing in building tool sets that focus on database software development specifically. So there were only about 4 players that we thought were worth a good look. We aligned that we would garner some feedback from the Gartner organization. We looked at technical data sheets that were available from some of these companies. We set up several demos. The whole process took us about 3 months, and in the end, we aligned that Datical was the vendor we wanted to work with. We had a couple of follow-up demos with them, with our technical teams, and also with our executive team, and we agreed that they are the ones we wanted to move forward with a proof of value. We met with them, described the parameters of the proof of value, and they helped us put this together and improve it from what we had started with. They also helped us document the executive paperwork as well, and our leaders agreed to make the investment based on that. We piloted as a proof of value 2 applications in order to document the process and understand how it would all work. And as soon as we felt comfortable about that, the pilot, by the way, took us about 5 months. Initially, we anticipated it would take about 6 weeks, but we had a lot of learning on both sides. The vendor needed to learn some of how we do our work, and we needed to learn some of what we needed to change in order to successfully adopt Datical within our environment. So it took a little bit longer because of that. But in the end, it all ended very well. After successfully piloting with the 2 applications, we started to modify our deployment processes, started to train people, and then we are currently iterating through other applications. We have a total of 60 applications that will be instrumented by the time we are done. As of right now, we've got about 17 that have the automated database deployment in place via Datical today. We're also currently integrating Datical DB deployments with our broader continuous deployment ecosystem with the other Atlassian tools and the software engineering teams. We've got one team that's currently piloting a full CI/CD automated implementation, and they'll be working through the rest of this year to get the process down complete. Once they are done, we will go back to the rest of these teams and do the same thing for all of them. So we expect in the next year and a half to 2 years to have our entire software deployment footprint in our environment automated via for CI/CD processes 100% with Datical at the center of it. It's working very well so far. We've certainly seen an increase in our throughput in deployment. We have seen a reduction in errors, and we're seeing a very consistent database landscape for those applications that now are instrumented. The best part of this, at least for my team, if I were to speak specifically for my team, is that the DBA developers are spending much less time in deployments than they used to. It's opening up some bandwidth for us to focus on other things. So it's been a very good transformation so far, and we're looking forward to even more positive changes as we iterate through the rest of our environment. So this is essentially my last slide at this point. If you're undergoing this journey, there are a number of things that you will need to keep in mind. It may be a little bit easier for those of you who are already in an agile environment, but if you're in the process of or haven't started down the agile path and you need to justify this kind of investment, be very clear on what your objectives are from the very beginning. What is it you're trying to achieve? Describe it more in business terms than in IT terms as you make this justification to your executive leadership. Invest time in articulating the value that automated database deployments will provide. As geeks, it's very easy to assume that the value will be obvious when you speak to it the first time around, but you really will need to use executive language to describe it, keeping in mind that executives are thinking primarily from a cost and resource value perspective, from a timeline perspective, and from a turnaround perspective. That is the kind of language and the kind of data you will need to compile to make the case easy. It does seem obvious, but keep in mind you're asking companies to spend a lot of money in what may be seen as a gamble, considering the challenges you're trying to address. That said, when you do compile the data, making the case becomes very, very easy. If you're not already agile, plan time to work through process issues when you go into implementation. If you're agile, it'll be a lot easier because for the most part, your database deployment will just be plugging into your already existing processes. But if you're not, you'll need to answer questions such as who owns deployments in which environments? Will you give QA, for instance, the ability to pull, or will it always be a push concept that CM or somebody else drives? What triggers a deployment? How do you plug into Jira or whatever tool set you're using to manage your tasks? Who needs to approve them? Do you need an approval? If you're going through CI/CD, will you allow changes as soon as they're deployed to flow through your environment? All of those questions can cause you to spend for days, if not weeks, or even months. If you have a number of stakeholders. Speaking of which, you're going to need to manage stakeholders very carefully throughout the entire process. If you already have a DevOps team in place, it'll become a lot easier. But for those of you who are just starting down the path of agile transformation like we were, we didn't even have a DevOps team in place at that time. That made it a whole lot more difficult to get what should be simple answers, but then you needed to pull in all these stakeholders and have discussions as to who owns what part of the process, who has the decision-making power on a given component, and so on and so forth. So all of that, if you already have it in place, is easier. If you don't have it in place, be prepared to start putting all of that mechanism in place, as it'll make your transformation a lot smoother. Never forget, when all is said and done, that this is a change management activity. It is not a tool implementation activity. It's not even a process implementation activity. It is ultimately a change management activity. You'll have to look at it from a people perspective, from a process or practices perspective. You'll also have to look at it from a tooling perspective, and in all of that, remember that people are at the center of it. Some people will buy into your vision immediately. Others will need to be pushed along or dragged along, hopefully not kicking and screaming, but that will happen. In all of that, communicate, communicate, communicate in many ways, many times. Identify who your key advocates are and work with those people. And as the rest of the organization sees success, they will simply follow as they observe it. That essentially is all of my presentation. I appreciate your time, and I'll hand it back over to Mitch.
Well, Mabuti, excellent presentation. Appreciate you sharing all of your knowledge and experience from this. Let's jump right to our questions here from our audience. First one goes right to the heart of culture, or at least one aspect of it. You talk about change management. How do you get past the DevOps blockers, the people that don't want to change?
To be honest, at first, we did have that problem. What we did is we identified the people who understood what we were trying to do and who were actually already advocating for it in silos. So the two teams that I said we started off with were people who had actually been reaching out to us already saying, hey, we need to do this a little bit differently. We've got these challenges. We've got these roadblocks. What can we do to address these? We worked with those two teams specifically, and they became our advocates on the software engineering side. When people saw how quickly they were able to deploy based on the changes we made, it helped the rest of the organization then want the same transformation also. At this time, we actually have a queue. We can't move quickly enough to instrument the rest of the teams. The ones who resisted at first are now in the queue waiting for their turn, so to speak. So we focused on the advocates, the ones who actually understood the vision and wanted the change.
Good lesson in change management. Yes.
Yep.
Next question is, how do you handle the DevOps tool build versus buy discussion?
Fortunately for us, because the agile transformation, the need for it was already happening across the enterprise, we already had some alignment at the senior leadership level that we would want to invest in tools that are already out there. We already knew that several organizations were doing this successfully and doing it very well. So we really didn't need to fight that particular battle. It was already understood that the tools existed, no need to reinvent the wheel, so to speak. A lot of our challenges within our environment are because a lot of our code is custom built. We didn't want to introduce that same challenge within the CI/CD agile pipelines as well. So for us, that was not a challenge we had because of it. We had aligned on the Atlassian set of tools, and we just ran with it. The only thing we had to do is make sure we identified a tool that would work with the rest of the tools we had already agreed to invest in. So Datacle checked that box.
Excellent. Our next question, is there one thing that you could do over again? If there was one thing you could do over again, what would that be?
Yes. I think for one of our pilot applications, so we chose one simple application and one simple to medium complexity application. One outcome of that was we defined all of our deployment transformation processes based on those two applications. But when we went to start instrumenting much more complex applications, we found that there were a lot of gaps within our process that needed to be addressed. So we found ourselves going back to the DevOps team, and in the early days, the DevOps team did not exist. So we had a lot of questions that needed answers, and that caused us a lot of churn. That's part of the reason why the process we thought would take 6 weeks ended up taking 5 months, because of challenges such as that. So if I could do one thing differently, I would use one simple application as part of the pilot and one complex application as opposed to two relatively simple applications.
Good advice. I love that advice. You mentioned a number of takeaways in the previous slide that we looked at and you covered. If you could boil it down to one lesson learned that you want to make sure everyone walks away from today's webinar, what would that one lesson be?
Could I ask for two?
Sure, we'll give you two. It was such a great presentation, of course.
Appreciate that. Number one, spend time putting the data together for executive justification, as I described it. Okay, that the more time you put upfront in that, the less time you'll spend butting heads with folks in order to make the investment in the investment phase. And then secondly, honestly, think of this as a change management activity, not a tool implementation activity. The two mindsets are very, very different. It truly is a change management activity.
It seems to come up a lot. I definitely want to emphasize that change management. Next question's a kind of multi-part one here. Typically with newly deployed code that is discovered to be broken, we prefer to fix forward rather than roll back. What do you do for database problems? Fix forward or roll back?
Very good question. And that actually is an interesting challenge because the way Dataco works, if you're going to fix forward, you've got two ways of, if you're going to fix broken deployments, you've got two ways to do it. You can deploy new code that addresses the broken code, or you can write rollback code that is deployed in the similar manner as actual code deployments are done. So that's a challenging concept. Now, from our perspective, we thought that writing rollback code was a lot more challenging proposition than deploying code that fixes the issue. So far, the only thing we've been doing is deploying code that fixes the issue. So we're essentially fixing forward, so to speak.
Okay, there's another part to this. Is there a time limit before doing a rollback, which probably necessitates a code rollback as well?
Because of the way our environment is, in production, we do not have that luxury. We have to fix issues immediately, and so we don't stop for that consideration. We may in non-prod environments, but in production, we act immediately. We write the code, do the analysis immediately, write the code immediately, and deploy it immediately. Sometimes deploying it only into the test and validation environment, do a quick validation to make sure it doesn't introduce new issues, and then deploy it to production. Then we retrospectively go back and work it through QA and the end-to-end environments.
Great. Well, I can tell you've struck a chord with our listeners. All of our questions are now multi-parts, so hang in there with me. Can DBAs do the job, or is there a need for a new position, a database DevOps engineer?
Very good question. The way we have it today, because DBAs do the development for what we call our core data set. Our core data set is that set of objects for which multiple applications depend on. The DBAs do all of that development. For code that is specific to an application, the software engineering team that owns that application does the development for that code. So we've kind of split it between the two teams. They do the software engineering teams and the database development team all park their code within the same Git repository, but the deployments into development are done by the disparate teams that actually develop the code. The way we set up our environment right now, the QA team does the pull into QA, so neither team is involved there unless something breaks, in which case that team that's responsible for that code creates the fixed code and then parks it in Git and tells the teams where to pull from. So it's a little bit separated within our environment. CM, configuration management, does a deployment into UAT environments and into production. That's how we've set up our environment today. Now, we are in the process of creating what we call the data management engineering team, which is essentially a team of dedicated DBA developers who eventually will own all of this going forward.
Interesting. Very good. The follow-on to that may be a little bit of a nuance to the questions. It's related to the same question. Can a normal DevOps engineer add the database DevOps engineering role without giving up on the other parts of DevOps engineering and its tasks?
Yep. Yeah, we do have a virtual DevOps team. We don't have a dedicated DevOps team today, and we have participation from all of these groups. So they do collaborate together, but we do have DBAs and folks from CM and folks from QA and folks from the software engineering teams and a dedicated DevOps tooling team. These are the folks, for instance, who manage the define and manage the Jenkins jobs, define and manage the links between Datical and Jenkins or Jira and so on and so forth. It's a small team, but the rest of the team is essentially a virtual team that collaborates together to make sure everything is working in concert.
Okay, excellent. Next question. What things did you hope to address but were unable to, and why weren't you able to get to them?
The challenge, I think this is the only set of challenges that we have not yet addressed today, which Datical is helping us solve, is we want some visual visibility into all deployments across board. We can go look one by one at each database and understand its state and then manually pull all of that data together to see how it's all working. Datical is working to enhance its graphical tool, its enterprise tool, to give visibility across all environments in a single snapshot. That'll help us a lot as far as reconciliation for when there are slight differences across the board. Now, the biggest challenge I see today is we have certain sets of databases that are used by multiple applications. In fact, we have one database that has about 30 applications, and by applications I'm using that term loosely. We do have the traditional applications, but you also have web services. So you may have 15 applications in that one database, and then 25 web services that also hit it in one form or another. Making changes and understanding the impact across the board quickly is a bit of a challenge. We're frankly still working through the process side to minimize impact from that perspective. That's really a process concern, not so much a tooling concern. We don't have the right answer yet. Sometimes when we deploy today's environment, we break things. We're still seeing that right now.
A work in progress, no doubt.
Absolutely.
Next question is, part one is, what are the documents you created before the implementation? Second part is, did you also have a guide for SOP, standard operating procedures?
Before the implementation itself, depending on how you define implementation, if I had to say before we started our piloting process, the only documentation we had was the roadmap that we built to describe how we would evaluate the set of tools on the market and how we would actually go about building the proof of value, and then how we would ultimately deliver on the value. Once we started the proof of value itself, we did put together department operating procedures on how to actually instrument an application for Datacle, and we put together working documents on how to actually deploy in a given environment. Those are the two documents that came out of the piloting process. Those are the documents I said needed to be modified significantly once we started getting into more complex deployments, because we chose simple applications to start with. So we had a lot of rework to do on that set of documentation. We're still working through the SOPs and the DOPs today. As I mentioned, we're still iterating through our environment, and we're still instrumenting the CI/CD processes. So it's all in flux right now, to be quite honest.
Okay, very good. What challenges did you find in integrating automated database deployments and testing into your CI/CD pipeline? You said that's a work in progress, but what challenges have you found?
I think the sequencing was probably the most challenging. In some cases, because our environment is heavily custom, in some cases you may need to deploy 3 or 4 database components and then deploy 2 or 3 application stack items, validate them, and then deploy 5 or 6 more database components, and then 5 or 6 other software component stacks. When you have sequencing issues like that, it can get a little complex sometimes. We've managed to get it right so far, but it can be a little bit tricky and challenging to put together so it works in a repeatable and predictable fashion. We're learning and we're getting better at it, but the orchestration is a challenge. Now keep in mind, we do have the one team that puts the Jenkins jobs together, collaborating with the virtual Devops team, getting all of those folks together to make sure they've got the right components all accounted for in the right order is key to all of this. Not as easy as it sounds.
Very good. Well, one last question that we'll wrap up on. The last question is, what's next in your journey? I think that's related to our topic today, not a life question, Mubhuti, but you can answer it however you feel.
Sure. I think we're looking forward to getting to a point where we have CI/CD fully implemented, and by that we truly mean being able to drop code that is complete in an environment, and in an automated fashion, it iterates through all of our non-production environments. We validate and test as expected, and then when the thumbs up is given at whatever interval, whether it's interval-based or some other mechanism, it pushes to production with minimal human intervention. That is where we'd like to get to. We've got an even broader initiative going on right now based on the chaos monkey mindset, to where we can deploy at any time to any environment and not cause any disruption. That's an even broader ambition that we're hoping to achieve over the next 3 or 4 years. Run everywhere all the time. And even when things break, not break service. Once we break the CI/CD barrier, that'll be our next focus, is just continuous availability, up at all times, and get out of the business, for instance, of disaster recovery testing. Just have all applications available in multiple data centers all the time. When one component fails, other components take over and code gets deployed to address the failed components seamlessly throughout our entire organization. It's ambitious, but organizations are doing it out there right now, the Netflixes and the Amazons of the world, so on and so forth. We'd like to get to that stage as well.
Well, excellent. Phenomenal presentation and questions and your answers, Mubhuti. Appreciate it very much. Well, we've reached you bet. We've reached the conclusion, and I know everybody's waiting for that, also that announcement around our 3 winners of the $50 Amazon gift cards. Congratulations go out to the following folks: Anutri E, Brian S, and Pam N. We will be following up with you to get your gift cards. So congratulations to our winners. Reminder that our webinar recording and slides will be available via an email with links and also on the Devops.com website. And be sure and check out the site too for other exciting webinar content that's coming up. I'd like to thank, and please join me in thanking our speaker today, Mabuti Nandu, Director of IT, Database and Middleware Administration at MedImpact Healthcare Systems. Thank you very much to our sponsor, also Dedicol, and we'd like to thank you, our audience, for spending your valuable time with us. It's been my pleasure to be your host today. Wish you a great day.